Hello everyone, welcome back to class. So today we're going to talk about genes and evolution. You will notice that this section is part of chapter 3, but I didn't want to include it in the first midterm, so that's why we didn't cover it. Now for those of you that are concerned about your grade from the first midterm, which should be about most of you, about half of you, the average was pretty low, then you'll want to probably attend Friday's live test review. It's going to be during class time, so at 2 p.m., and the link can be found in the announcements tab. I'm going to post it probably Wednesday, so that on Friday at 2 p.m. you can click the link to the Google Meet, and we can talk about the most commonly missed questions and some tips and tricks for next time so that you guys can all do better. Now, let's move on to this kind of Chapter 3 bonus section. And so this is going to cover genes and evolution. So we're going to talk about how genes and evolution play a role in behavior. So the first section is focusing on genes. So genes are the basic unit of heredity. So pretty much it's the things we inherit from our parents. So it's passed on from your parents to the offspring, and this is why sometimes they'll say you look like your mother or you act like your mother, things like that. So you inherit something from a parent who definitely inherited it from their parent. So this is how genes are passed down. Now, what makes up a gene? So genes are made up of DNA. So DNA is what we call genetic information, and it's the blueprint for pretty much everything. So what we'll talk about is hereditary. So hereditary means something that is passed down from parents. DNA itself is made up of what we call bases. So there's 4 different bases, A, T, G, and C. You don't need to know their full names. Just know A, T, G, and C for this class. And know that A always bonds to T and G bonds to C. And that's really all you need to know about these base pairs, we call them. And the order of these base pairs determines the information that's stored on them. So if we look at the DNA, then we have this thing called a genome. So a genome is a complete set of genetic material for an organism. In other words, it's all the DNA of an individual kind of combined. That's a genome. Now, DNA itself is the chemical substance that contains nucleotides. You don't need to know what nucleotides is, but just know genomes are made up of DNA. And then within DNA are genes. So genes are a section of DNA that's used for hereditary transmission. In other words, genes are the things that are passed from one parent to their offspring. Then we have these things called chromosomes. So chromosomes is just a strand of DNA that's wound together in a double helix configuration. So if we look on the bottom here, we have DNA here, and then we've got here, we've got kind of these long bands, which is a chromosome. So this is 2 chromosomes. There's always a pair. So we've got one here on the left and one on the right. And then these dark purple bands, those represent genes. So genes will take up certain space on a chromosome or of a gene. And then it's important to note that you have 46 chromosomes in every cell. So you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Because remember, you've got a copy of each one. So when we say you have 46 chromosomes, that's 23 pairs. And then each cell has all of these, and you have millions of cells that make up the human body. So that's just kind of how things work. So why do we need genes? What do they do? So we have our DNA, and then there's a protein that helps with what we call transcription, which turns DNA into RNA, which is similar to DNA, but it allows us to read it. So the body can't read DNA, so we have to transcribe it into RNA. And then from RNA, the body can read the information of the genes and use translation to turn it into amino acid chains. And an amino acid chain is pretty much just an unfolded protein. So it's a really long chain, and then when you fold that up, it creates a protein. And different proteins will lead to different behaviors. So that's just kind of some general DNA, what's happening biologically. But why do we care about that? So we care about that because when we're talking about behavior, we are talking about how genes are passed on, and how different things can be inherited by parents or and to the children. So when we're looking at inheritance, then we'll be looking at two different things, either genotype, so that's looking at the genes themselves, or phenotype, so that's the observable characteristic due to the genetic makeup. In other words, genotype is talking about the genes, and phenotype is talking about the behavior. So when talking about, say, flowers, you'll have the genes big B, little b, that would be the genes of the parents. The phenotype would be what color, so what you can observe. So it'd be purple is the phenotype, the genotype is big B, little b. And then when we're looking at a square like this, then we're looking at how things are inherited from parents to their offspring. So remember that inheritance, we're talking about those 46 chromosomes, and because we've got 46 chromosomes, when you're getting copies from your parents, then you're actually getting one copy from your mom and one copy from your dad. So since you have two copies, then how do we know what the phenotype or genotype is going to be? So if this is you, then what you can guarantee is that 50% of your genetic makeup comes from your dad, and 50% comes from your mom. So that's that line there, okay? So you are 50% mom and 50% dad. Now your sibling is also going to be 50% mom and 50% dad, right? Because, I mean, that's just how it works. Any offspring of a couple is going to be 50% mom, 50% dad. Now, because you and your sibling, you're not identical, your mom and dad each have multiple different genes and types of genes, then the genetic relationship between you and a sibling, assuming you're not identical twins, is also going to be 50%. And that's because you're going to have the 25% is going to be the same from your mom, and 25% is going to be the same from your dad. So you and a sibling will have 50%, you and dad's 50%, you and mom is 50%. So that's just kind of how that works. This is how it works for going back more. So grandparents, you'll be 25%. You don't really need to memorize these, but the important thing here is twin studies, or with twins. So if you're an identical twin, we call it identical because you have 100% of the same genes as your identical twin. And fraternal twins are similar to just normal siblings. So you're again going to only be 50% similar. So when talking about inheritance, then a gene, then you have a pair, right? So you've got big A, or big A, or little a, little a. Now, one pair or one type of gene is going to be what we call dominant. So a dominant characteristic controls the display. In other words, if there's a dominant characteristic, that's the one that's going to show. And then if a gene pair is recessive, then the characteristic will not show if paired with dominant, but it will show if paired with another recessive. So what I'm talking about here is if we look at these genotypes with big A right here. So if we say the dominant gene is big A and the recessive gene is little a, then looking at big A, the phenotype, or what we see, is going to be controlled by the dominant gene. So big A says yellow, so the phenotype is going to be yellow. Now if we look at little a on the bottom, recessive, little a means green. So because we have two recessive, it's going to be green. Now you need to know the difference between dominant and recessive when you're talking about this genotype here, which is big A, little a. So when you have a combination of one dominant gene and one recessive gene. For this, then because you have a dominant gene, then the dominant gene is going to cancel out that recessive and make your phenotype the dominant phenotype. So in this case, yellow. Now, when we're talking about it, then we'll also talk about either homozygous or heterozygous. So homozygous means the same gene. So again, if we talk about that big A's and the little a's, then here that would be homozygous would mean big A, because it means same. But homozygous can also mean little a, okay? Now heterozygous means different, so different genes. So the only option here is big A, little a, okay? So there's two options for homozygous and one option for heterozygous. There's another example down here where we're talking about chins. So here the dominant allele with chins would be whether or not you have this cleft in your chin. I often call that a butt chin. But the dominant allele will be we'll call that big B. Oh, did I lose it? I lost it. Okay, well we'll call that big B. Why isn't this working? We'll call that big B. Okay. So if your mom has it, okay, so let's say your mom has it and your dad doesn't have it. Oh, I forgot how to make a B. Then your dad would be little b, right? So then how do you decide if your parent has it or not? So let's go over that. So again, let's talk about, say, a widow's peak. So if we go back to this image, that's what Chris Hemsworth has here, that little V on your head. So having a widow's peak is dominant. Okay, so we're going to call that a W. So let's say dad has one. So dad is going to be big W, so he has it. And we're going to assume he's homozygous, so the same. Now mom doesn't have a widow's peak, so we're going to do a little w, if I can make that work. So because she doesn't have it and it's recessive, then we automatically know she's homozygous. Okay? Now, we want to know what are the probabilities that their offspring or your siblings would have a widow's peak. So what we'll do is we'll draw this down. So we'll do a W, a big W for dad in everything. And then we'll take moms and we'll put them across. So that's a little W in everything. Okay, so now if we're looking at the offspring, we can see that 100%, or everyone, so that's 100%, is big W, little w. So that means they are heterozygous, because that's different, right? You've got two different genes, so that's heterozygous. Now, what is the phenotype going to be? Because this is the genotype, so what's the phenotype? The phenotype will be that they will have a widow's peak. Why? Because we have a big W. Because there's a big W, and that's a dominant gene, then that's the gene that's going to be expressed. Okay? Now you're probably wondering, what about if, okay, we're going to use A's again because it's just easier. What if dad is heterozygous, right? So he's different, and mom's also heterozygous. What happens then? Okay, so we're going to take this A and we're going to put it down. That's an arrow, guys. That's an arrow. And we're going to make a big A in both, okay? And then we're going to do the same thing and put the little a down. Little a, okay? And now we're going to take moms and we're going to go sideways. So we'll do big A for mom. And sideways again for the little a for mom. Little a, little a. So now we have different outcomes depending on what genes the kids get. So we have 1 out of 4 are big A. 1 out of 4 are little a. And 2 out of 4 are big A, little a, right? So that means that if mom and dad are both heterozygous, you have a 1 in 4 chance, or 25%. We're going to change color here. Let's go blue. So big A, you have 25% chance of a child being big A. And then you have a 5% chance of a kid being little a. And then each of these squares is 25. So 2 out of 4 is 50%. Okay? So if mom and dad are both heterozygous, then you have a 25% chance that the offspring will be homozygous dominant, so same dominant. 25% chance they'll be homozygous recessive, so same recessive, and a 50% chance that they will be heterozygous. And we call that heterozygous dominant. Okay? Now, this is just if a certain characteristic is controlled by one gene. There are some traits, such as skin color or eye color, that are controlled by multiple genes, and that's what we call polygenetic transmission. Now, that's really all I need you guys to remember about this. So there's some traits or phenotypes that are controlled by one gene, and that's where we can use these squares. But then there's some phenotypes or phonetic traits that are controlled by multiple genes. Now there's some other terms you're going to want to know, such as heredity, which is the passage of characteristics from parents to to offspring using genes, and then heritability. So how much variation in the population is because of genetic differences. Okay, so heredity is the passage of genes, and heritability is explaining the differences in a population due to genes. So we're going to stop there for right now, and then we'll continue with genes and evolution in the next video.